there's some exciting new changes that are coming to the PFC Entertainment Network. New podcasts, new hosts, new topics, new guests. It's a whole new ballgame as we enter a new schedule beginning this fall for the network. On Mondays it kicks off with Say What, followed by the flagship show, the Close to the Heart podcast on Tuesdays. Wednesdays, we go back in time with Power Tripping Through the Age. It gets a little hot on Fridays with new episodes of The Heat Vent, and on Saturdays you will see alternating podcasts between the Real Podcast and Turnbuckle Time Machine. Also returning this fall will be Hanging with the Hitman with Todd Gilbert and Brett Fortney. You can check out all of the great shows from the PFC Network on Spotify, iTunes, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and iHeartRadio.
Welcome to Say What.
I am Kristin Watt. I am a wife, a mom, a community advocate, and apparently I'm a podcast host now.
This is a takeover. This is a takeover. This is not an exercise. This is a takeover.
Hello, I'm Charles Watt. I am the husband of the normal host of Say What, Kristin Watt, and she has graciously allowed me to take over this episode to talk a little bit about menopause, which is not what you'd normally expect me to want to talk about as a 50-year-old male, but on a very personal respect, my wife has had to deal with it. People that I know are currently going through discovering or trying to figure out if they're having to deal with it. And as I've been growing up through my life, I've witnessed people in my life that have had to suffer through it. And I think that I'm rocking in the chair, sorry. I think that it's something that we don't have a proper understanding of. And because we don't have a proper understanding of, more people do more suffering from going through it than they need to. There are a lot of aspects within the reproductive health system, I believe, get pushed into the dark. Menopause is one of them, and kind of the main one that I want to talk about right now. And because they get pushed in the dark, we don't understand them. That means we don't educate about them. That means we are not prepared for them. And it causes lack of care and suffering. So what is menopause? Well, our basic understanding, I think, in society is, as I understood it growing up, is, and people around me might basically kind of say, is that when a woman hits middle age, late age, they stop having periods, their menstruation cycle stops. Their ovaries, eggs dry up, they start having hot flashes, and they get cranky. And that seems to kind of be the end of our understanding of what that might be. The problem with that is it's not a switch. It's not a period from one to the other, and it really isn't at the point of what we classify menopause as. So the technical classification of menopause is when a woman is in menopause or at menopause, is when they've had 12 months of missed periods or menstruation cycle has stopped for a full 12 months. Then they're classified, yep, definitely you hit the mark, you're menopause. And then literally like the day after I don't know. They're like post-menopause. So, and it's not that simple. It's not a switch. It's not a, stage from one to the other. It really is, when you talk about menopause, it's a 3-stage kind of process. It's perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause. And a lot of the suffering and battle for understanding that comes is in the perimenopause phase. And that happens at any time technically it starts from 40 to 42. It can last for 8 years. Menopause technically is averaged at 50, which is my age right now as a male. Dog's killing me. And so if menopause can happen at 50, perimenopause technically can start at 40 to 42. It definitely can start much earlier. So it can start in the mid 30s. And when perimenopause hits, that's when all of the symptoms that are possibly related to menopause can happen. Now, this is hot flashes is the one that and night sweats is the one that we classically relate to menopause. That can start, but that might come later. But there are a lot of like body aches and pains, joint aches and pains. There's vaginal dryness. There's sexual dysfunction, sexual mood change. There's mood change. There's a lot of stuff that happens. Unfortunately, it was on my iPad here that I'm looking into that I was relying on to look at the whole list. But it starts at 35, 38, 40, 42, and it's going to last for at least a decade. And these things come on because the reproductive health system is incredibly complex. And once it starts decreasing the estrogen that's being pushed into the system, all of these changes start happening. And it's technically kind of classified or referred to as a tapering off. So perimenopause begins with a slow tapering of the estrogen, but it's not a tapering. It's a up and down, up and down. So if you ever look at a stock that has, decreased in value over a long time, it definitely decreased in a long line. But over that long line, it's erratic. It's up and down. And that's kind of what the hormonal discharge and decrease happening over even in the early period of time. And that's what causes all of these the insomnia and the mood changes and the night sweats and the hot flashes and the vaginal many dysfunctions and the uterine bleeding and all these. And while the menstruation cycle is still happening, it really messes with that because it's starting to taper off and shut that down. So you also have incredibly complicated and problematic and painful menstruations and erratic menstruations, and the flows start changing and things like that. So this is, that's not fun to live through. That's not something that I want to experience. If I go through the slightest bit of change in my function in terms of any kind of sexuality or even just kind of, urination or anything like that, like I'm threatened. I go to the doctor, and this is something that these women and people who are, who have these parts have been dealing with just through the reproductive system as a normality. Every month they go through something. And then now when it starts shutting down, it puts them through something different. And as I said, it can start at 35. It starts tapering at that point. And as you go through the perimenopause phase, all of the different symptoms can start popping up. And they're the only symptom that's actually like linked to menopause is the hot flashes, maybe the night sweats. All of the other stuff can be anything else. And it's like if you have MS or rheumatoid arthritis or any of these other kind of unicorn diagnosis, total body problems, you have to go to a doctor with every single thing that comes upon you to get some help or get some relief or get some ideas. And you have to have either yourself or a healthcare professional link all of these things together to be able to help you understand that that might be what is going on with you, or to be able to rule it out from other things that are going on with you. Because so body, aches and pains, body pains, vaginal dryness, mood changes, these things can come up when you type them in a WebMD, you're going to get a lot of different options. So you go through this perimenopause phase, this tapering, for 8 years or whatever. And at the end, you're going to have a year or two, or maybe 5, which I refer to the cliff. That's where you kind of drop off into actually wondering if you're in menopause. And so menopause technically is 12 months without your period. You don't just stop and get to 12 months. You have a lot of false starts to that. So as soon as you start missing periods and you start being irregular in that, now you're counting for that 12 months. Now you're kind of in what I refer to as the menopausal phase, where you're counting, where you're looking for the validity because you know you're in the stage. Before this, you've had up to a decade or a decade and a half of all of the symptoms and problems and suffering. And then now you're hoping that you're in the state and it's just going to end. Man, I'm suffering. I want to end. I want it to over. I want it over. It's like being desperately in a flu. You want the flu to break and tomorrow you can wake up and feel okay. You have this programming, this idea that that's what this is going to bring. And it doesn't come quick because you miss one period and you think you're counting and you get it back. You miss 5 periods and you get it back. Then you miss 7 periods and then you get it back. So it's not a quick process. It's not a simple thing. It's not. And during this is usually the worst time for all of the different symptoms, the hot flashes and the insomnia and the mood changes and the body aches and the problematic, painful, erratic periods, because they are erratic because the body's shutting this down. So in this period, it can last years. It's the most desperate for it to end because you're looking for an end. You're looking for that 12 months, no period. And then hopefully, and sometimes it still can, but hopefully that's it. So when you hit that 12 months, if you hit it, you hit that 12 months and you're done. Your estrogen has fallen off of the cliff after tapering for a while. Your eggs and your ovaries won't work anymore because the hormones have not been there. It doesn't mean they've dried up. They've dried up from the hormone production. They're still there, but they're not viable anymore. And you have the moment where I am postpartum. And the hope, or even the idea in society, or the education and the understanding, is that now you're going to not have to deal with, you're not going to have to deal with the symptoms. You're not going to have to deal with it. So, postpartum, all of the symptoms linger. The only symptoms that don't linger or can't linger are the ones specifically related to menstruation, because you're not menstruating anymore. So you're not going to have irregular flows. The flows are done. You're not going to have irregular menstruation. The menstruation is done. But you can still have the pain, the cramps, just as regular. You're going to have all of the hot flashes. You can have all of the problems sleeping. You can have all of the uterine bleeding. You can have all of the UTIs. And the other thing, the major thing that we do understand and know about it all, menopause and pre and post and all that, is that it leads to a huge increase in osteoporosis, and it tends to really outbalance cholesterol and things like that in the system, and the way it adds weight and an impossible like weight, you can't weight loss, the weight that adds on in these stages and things like that, especially towards the post system, are very, like with the hot flashes, very real and very linked directly to these stages and things that go on. So the postpartum phase, minus specifically the menstruation stuff, can last from postpartum till death. So there's no solving any of this. It doesn't go away necessarily for a lot of people. And if it goes, it can come back. So if you can start this process of suffering of a stack of issues at 35, and it can last through on top of giving birth and doing all the stuff you do if you do it, but it can 35 on until you die. That's decades and decades of suffering from an issue. And that's why I think it's important. I personally, my wife got plunged into it through hysterectomy. So there are surgical and there are medical issues that can advance you or immediately put you into this state. And that's its own really jarring thing to a body. So like the body, like I was saying, like this is a 15, 20, 25 year process for a very complex biological entity to change itself over to be able to survive as a non-reproductive entity. A lot of creatures in nature, when they're done in that viability way, their body shuts down, they die. The human body turns itself over into something so it can still live and be viable. And it takes a long time. And there are, through hysterectomies, partial hysterectomies, ablations, there are diseases, cancers, and things like that can plunge somebody into this, almost overnight. And when I said it's not a switch, it can be a switch, but that's not a good thing. The people who have it turned on them as a switch, it's really hard because it is such a fast change. Now, this is important to me because, not just because my wife's dealt with it through hysterectomy, that I know people dealing with it. It's important to me because a lot of reproductive health things are, as I say, on the dark side of the moon of healthcare, because we push them over there so we don't have to talk about them. We push them over there so we don't have to regard them in how they affect public policy. And we push them over there because they're uncomfortable. But by doing so, all of these things mean we don't have an understanding of it, both in our own particular understanding what we need and a consciousness as a society which doesn't inform our healthcare industry to care about it. And that leads to suffering. So as far back as my teenage years, I remember girls, even pre-menstruation cycle, having to deal with things like polycystic ovaries and endometriosis, and incredibly problematic and painful and irregular periods and flows and things like that. So the solution to that was to have birth control. It was one of the tools and the medications available to provide a relief from suffering. And we as a society, like we look at reproductive health as four things: pregnancy and birth, and abortions and birth control. And the birth control, I wish it had a different word, because so much of what it does is actually help. It's a hormonal control. There's a lot of issues within the reproductive health system. Like I said, endometriosis, polycystic ovaries, the incredibly painful, irregular flows, things like it helps, and it's necessary. And anytime we're arguing over whether someone can have that or not, we're arguing over whether someone has control of their own health or control of their own suffering. And the reason why we don't talk about all of the other things other than birth control associated with it is to keep the control, to take it away, because they want to take away the birth part. But that means they take away all of the other things that it helps, and it increases suffering. And so it's another thing pushed into the dark. But that even happens with pregnancy. Like we don't talk about maternal mortality. 1 in 2,500 women in this country die just as a result of being pregnant. Infant mortality, preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, all of the different ways that hips and spines can be forever, altered from having a baby. Like, we don't talk about all of the risks because we don't want to give anyone pause or reason to want to not be pregnant. We just say, go do it, and we'll figure it out. And along that path, even if you go on that path, miscarriages. I don't know if you have children. My first time being pregnant with my first wife, it was everything I ever wanted in the world, was to be married and be pregnant and have a family. And it ended up being an ectopic pregnancy, which is pretty much a miscarriage. It just works out the same way. And I felt like it was this 1 in a million thing that happened to me. So earlier in my life, before I even met my first wife, I won $50,000 from MTV. And it was like, 1 in a million kind of thing. Like, everybody I ever met's like, I've never met anybody that won that much money. And it's the lowest amount of big money to win. But people always say that. I've never met anybody. I felt that way with the miscarriage, with the ectopic pregnancy. And then we started talking to all the adult women in our families and that we worked with and that we knew. And everyone was like, oh, I had one. Everyone has one. And that's not something you're told. That information is pushed onto the dark side of the moon. And it rocks you, because when you encounter it, you're not ready for it. Now, with a miscarriage, it's not a health issue. When it rocks you, you're just already rocked. All of these other things with reproductive health that you don't know about, aren't ready for, the doctors don't care about, don't know about. When it rocks you, your health is on the line. So that's why this is important. Further down the line, I'll go into control of your own health. When my wife and I, Kristin, were pregnant with, before I even get into that, I would like to say, I want to make a plug. Can you see that? I don't know if you can see that. Anyway, What Fresh Hell Is This? By Heather Carina is a great book. It's about perimenopause, menopause, other indignities in you. It's what to expect when you're not expected to expect anything more. It's an amazing, simple, well-based, well-read primer that it's easy to read, and it's also got a lot of technical stuff kind of laced throughout there. In fact, there's an appendix towards the end to talk about menopause for trans women, because they are dealing with hormones you're as a trans woman, you're dealing with hormone situations, and menopause is a hormone situation. And they might be a little different, but they're still in the same thing. So this is a great book. I think everybody should get it and read it. Anyway, back to where I was. We were going into tubal ligations. So when my wife and I were pregnant with our second child, it was my second child and her second child. We both had a child prior. Both of those previous children came from problematic births that came from cesarean sections. So we were worried. Going into this one, it was a little issue. There were some issues. It wasn't easy. It wasn't as bad as the other ones have been, but it still made my wife say, I don't want to have any more kids. We knew she was going to have to get another cesarean. This was going to be her second cesarean section. Okay. So once we went into the doctor, we found a doctor that Nicole, a lady that we worked with, recommended Dr. Todd. We went to Dr. Todd. Loved the guy. He was real laid back. He was a nice, easy doctor. It was great. The only issue was from the very first visit when my wife said, when you're in there for the cesarean section, I want a tubal ligation. I don't want to have any more kids. And he didn't say, that's okay, we'll do that. He said, okay, we'll talk about that. And talk about that is what they did. Every visit my wife made to that doctor, they asked her again and again and again and again and again and again. Are you sure you want it? You sure you want it? You sure you want it? Did you talk to your husband? Did you talk to your husband? Did your husband say okay? Did your husband say okay? Are you sure you want it? Every time. The doctor, the nurses, it was never ending. And the idea that you can't go get a tubal ligation just because you want it. Like, she was asking for it while they're in there for a cesarean section during her second pregnancy. It should have been a no-brainer. It would have been check one box, we'll double check before you go, into the procedure. But no. And even to the point that when they had her under and she was in the hospital, they asked me if I said it was okay. If she could have permission on her own body. And, that lit me. So I don't want to get into my response to the doctors, but that's why these things matter. They're all tied together. We don't talk about it, all of these things. We don't talk about all this, so we don't have to deal with it. So we don't have to give women and people with these systems control over their own fucking bodies. Sorry. It's all tied together. And because it's uncomfortable. Because we don't want to think about it. We don't want to worry about it. And the people that pay the price are people who go through these things. So, and that's not just it. That's just kind of like this is off the top of my head, really, in all honesty. I have notes and stuff, but I didn't reference. But at the end of the day, there's so many more issues that we don't know about that come from reproductive health and reproductive health issues. And the care is denied on many levels because, first of all, people want to control women's bodies. Second of all, it's uncomfortable. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to talk about menopause because it's old ladies. We don't want to talk about miscarriage because we don't worry, young women from having babies. But there's other things that we still don't know, that we're still discovering. There's a cost to, as I said, to just pregnancy and birth and things like that. And we don't talk about the risks and the cost of that. And there are things that happen to the body or that post birth that never leave a body. But we shouldn't have to say that. We shouldn't have to say that if someone doesn't want to go through 9, 10, 12 months of discomfort and suffering, they shouldn't have to on that level. But even aside from that, to the other side, there's costs. So every time we've gotten into this, we're a surgery happy country. We cut open for everything, and we don't understand what the cost involved later on always is. So when we start carving into bodies for cesarean sections, and we start carving into bodies for hysterectomies, and then we start poking into bodies for all these different laparoscopies, with multiple little things plugging in and gouging around, we don't understand that there's a cost that comes to pay later on. And people with reproductive health systems, women who give birth and go through hysterectomies and things like that, they're paying a cost that we don't understand. And that leads to why I want to bring my wife back on her own podcast, because she's going through something that very few people have even heard of. And we only discovered it because she had to go through a lot of pain, suffering, and unknown issues between her second cesarean section and her hysterectomy. And the journey between those to discover what she's dealing with was just suffering. And as this whole thing is about, is if we don't understand, we don't educate, and we don't have the proper healthcare system in place, women suffer. And my wife is suffering. So I would like to bring my wife on to talk about what she's specifically going through and explain her particular disorder. Honey?
Oh my God. I get to be on my own show?
I'm sorry. You actually were looking at me like you were ready, so I threw it to you naturally.
I'm trying to be funny.
No,
Hi.
okay, yeah, I'm sorry.
Thank you for having me on my show.
I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you for, I want to start by saying, because we're going to dive right into what you were just talking about, but I want to start by saying that our amazing founder and producer here at the PFC Entertainment Network, when I came to Jason and said, my husband's going to talk about menopause, he's like, who came up with this idea? And I said, you don't understand. You don't hear men talk about this subject very often. And I kind of laughed because I'm spoiled. You and I have been together 16 years. We talked about everything, but particularly, we both share common ground and common ideas about women's health. It's weird to see male feminists, like we're still in a society that don't understand what that means. So everyone, let me introduce you to my husband, who is a raging male feminist who cares about women and me and our health. And we also have 2 daughters. So this is something that's very prevalent in our home. But to get right back on subject, I do appreciate that you wanted to do this as a subject matter, because not only because of...
Can I interrupt you?
Sure.
Like, just with going back to the menopause, is there anything that you want to add specifically to menopause?
Before
there was more I wanted to lay out on the symptoms and the suffering, but I literally, my iPad, I didn't realize I was going to be filming on the iPad, and all my notes were on the iPad. And at the last minute, I was like, oh. Yep.
Not a problem. So without beating a dead horse, here's the thing with menopause. You definitely hit on the subject of the fact that, our parents, Jason's on producing right now, and I'm sure he'll pop on at the end like he always does, but because we love that. Our parents' generation is just, you didn't talk about these types of things. And so I did grow up, at least me, familiar with it. I watched my mom go through it naturally, and all the stages you've already laid out there. And I think women talk about it with each other a little bit. And we add humor to it, because if you don't laugh, you'll cry. But there is absolutely, the natural progression of things, which is just, I think it really speaks to the fact that we as women are pretty freaking amazing creatures. Not only that we can actually birth, and humans and go through that whole process, and not only birth a child if we choose to, but then feed that child from our body. I mean, like, our bodies are incredible, but it's a blessing and a curse, because you said,
it's an incredibly complex system, and when it turns over into the shutting down so you can still live, that's a hard process.
Yes.
So.
Now, I will not ever know what that decade feels like technically, because I, as you mentioned, had to have it surgically, and we'll get into that and why that happened in a minute. But as far as when we say things like night sweats and hot flashes, this is, I think, a lot of people, particularly men, just because you guys don't experience it, like, you don't have the same biology as we do. When I experienced my first hot flash, it was actually, when you mentioned Dr. Todd, having to ask me 1,000,000 times about getting the tubal, I didn't know that when you got a tubal ligation, because they don't talk to you about this at the doctor, it chops off 50% of your estrogen. So I actually started getting hot flashes after the tubal ligation, and I thought they were bad until I had to have the hysterectomy. And once that happened, hot flash, I don't even think is a good name for it. It's such a, it seems so minuscule to what you're feeling, because not only is it like think of the hottest you have ever been, where you thought you were going to dehydrate and throw up, and it comes on you in a second, and it just overwhelms you, and you could just be cooking dinner, and then all of a sudden you start almost feeling like you're going to have an anxiety attack.
I can literally feel the heat coming off your skin.
Yeah,
when you're at your worst.
Yeah,
and you're normally like a cold skinned person.
Right.
So
but going through that sudden temperature change in literally a second, and then it lasts for however long it's going to last, but then having it at night, so now you're sleeping and your body's trying to heal and repair, and then getting up, just being woken up to that panic, like it's psychological, emotional, and physiological, all at the same time. And so every woman I speak to that goes through this for whatever reason, whatever stage they're in, whether it's tubal ligation, it doesn't matter, but in menopause, we get it. It's an unspoken sisterhood, because it's so hard to put into words if you haven't experienced these things yourselves. Then there's the mood swings you mentioned, which, we already have to suffer pretty much our whole life with the stereotype of, we are hysterical and overly emotional.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, like, we bleed, we birth, we feed, parts of our body die, like, and then all the things in between. You're lucky we're not crazier than we are, okay? Like, that's how I feel about it. Like, it's a lot going on. And in some ways I feel blessed, because there are experiences that men will never have that I get to have, and bonds with my children and things like that. But at the same time, I don't wish this shit on anybody, really, like the menopause stuff. But it is something that
how, like, nurturing, and like, I love babies of all sorts, and I wish for the bond that you have.
Yeah.
I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't choose to do I wouldn't take on. No.
The trade-off sucks. So anyway, but I mean, that's probably what I would say as far as, but I mean, my own lived experience with what I've gone through. I mean, what was it, 4 years ago now that I've had the hysterectomy. And of course, many women have hysterectomies, and they're absolutely necessary. Mine was 100% life-saving necessary.
Although we've been very quick to be, let's just rip it off. Like, our whole approach, 40 years ago was just hysterectomies. They ripped them out left and right. So we had to, like, get away from that. But, and something actually, something I didn't mention was one of the few things dealing with menopause or anything like that is hormone replacement therapy. That's the one thing they know they can kind of help to try to stop the osteoporosis or maybe start dealing with some symptoms and things like that. And when you get a hysterectomy or a partial or an ablation or anything like that, that you have to really make that decision because you're doing a fast stop of what's going on. So that's something you have to really consider, especially without knowing what you're about to deal with. That's hard.
It's true. Not to mention which I think you're probably about to go into a little more about my, our experience and what talk about complications and what happened in my, what's gone on in my life and what you've lived through with me. I am not able to take hormone replacement therapy. So the first 2 years of this for me were 20 times worse than what they could have been because of the condition that I have and my inability to actually take hormone replacement therapy. There's many women who have, history of breast cancer and stuff who cannot take it either. So there's just so many nuances to it. And every woman and every person have such a different, no different than our DNA and our fingerprints are different. Yeah. Your experience as a woman biologically is no different. Everyone has a story. Everyone has a situation. So anyway, that's all I'll say about menopause and whatever you want to get into from here. Like said, let's do it.
You have a specific unicorn, diagnosis kind of thing, which is an adhesion-related disorder, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you came into understanding it in between the cesarean and needing the hysterectomy. Mm-hmm. So just briefly on that little journey, because once you knew you had adhesion, you were dealing with it, and getting the hysterectomy, you had good doctors. In between the cesarean and getting the good doctors and not knowing that your diagnosis, you were going through a lot of pain and suffering. And I think at that point, the people you were dealing with didn't have any idea what you could have had, so it delayed you being able to get to somebody good, which ultimately you found the good doctors yourself. Nobody sent you there. Yeah. So can you just kind of say briefly what the how you had to learn about what you had? Do you know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. I can literally, it's difficult to talk about how we got here without going through a long backstory, but what I can do to get to that is very brief bullet points. When I was 14 years old, I was diagnosed, I was 14 years old. I was diagnosed with polycystic ovarian disease, and now it's called syndrome, I think, or something. Anyway, long story short, continuous cysts were forming in my ovaries. They told me I probably would never be able to have children on my own without assistance. I just had it in my head I was never going to get to have kids. Super painful. I had to go to summer school every year of my life because I missed so much school due to pain. And there was the only, as you mentioned earlier, the only solution was birth control, really, to help moderate that. So I was on birth control very early. Then, randomly, I got pregnant. And I never expected that. I ended up with my first child, first marriage. Had the C-section, as you mentioned. That scar tissue that forms when you have a surgery was the beginning of what I didn't know was going to happen later. And that was, I ended up with several other minor abdominal surgeries, gallbladder, stuff like that in between pregnancies. Then, as you mentioned earlier, we had Zoe. And in between that, I had 14 miscarriages in between my first pregnancy and when I met you. And that wasn't, I had 14 miscarriages. And that is because women who have polycystic ovarian syndrome.
You've never told me that.
Really?
Yeah.
Surprise!
Yay!
Yeah. But here's the thing.
I'm sorry.
The reason for that was because when women have polycystic ovarian syndrome, your insulin levels they're resistant or all over the place. Yeah. So when your insulin levels are at a certain level,
it screws
your
up
body
the
can't
hormones necessary to make the system work right.
You can't sustain a pregnancy. So I thought there was something very wrong with me. I was like, why does this keep happening? Blah, blah, blah. So I'm not trying to minimize that, but I am going to get quickly to the adhesion disorder because it's all related. So that being said, we had Zoe, our youngest, and yet again, once you have one C-section, 99% of the time you're going to get a second one because they don't want your uterus to rupture during birth, okay? So I went through a second cesarean section. And what I didn't know, because we were in Texas at the time, and I've mentioned this on a previous episode, access to healthcare in Texas is not the same as we are here in Michigan. After you have your baby in 8 weeks, if you don't have insurance through your job, you just don't have insurance. So I went for years without reproductive health care, my pap smears, etc., other than going to Planned Parenthood to get pap exams. I had endometriosis, which I didn't know, and I just thought it was my polycystic stuff. Endometriosis is like pouring oil on a fire. So I had adhesions, which is scar tissue that looks like spider webs that loop on to your organs. Instead of them being able to move freely, it starts, as you mentioned, like gluing things together.
So, yeah. Think of it this way. Like if these are two organs, even though they're smashed together, they're supposed to slide around.
Correct.
Once they glue together, this scar tissue glue together, every time your body moves, they can't move.
Correct.
They're pulled. And then with her, and I'll just jump to this now, it was so important because it affects your colon and your intestines.
Liver.
And when when she was going in for looking for some pain and things going on in her abdomen, they were going to go in like a normal laparoscopic surgery, and they realized they couldn't do that because all of her stuff was pulled out of place. And if they go in on an abdominal surgery like you normally would on any person, on her, they're gonna perforate her bowels and possibly
They almost
kill
did.
her.
They almost did.
Yeah,
so
they almost did.
To fast forward to that story, though, basically, bottom line is all these adhesions kept growing and growing and growing. And Jason, you're listening in as you're producing. If you'd have met me 5-6 years ago, I would be unrecognizable to you. I had to stop working. I couldn't barely walk. I was in so much pain. I couldn't go to the bathroom. I had so many problems. And I kept thinking it was because of the polycystic ovaries and just reproductive stuff. And so, long story short, we moved to Michigan. It got really, really bad, debilitating, really. And we went to the OB-GYN, and I begged them, please give me a hysterectomy. Please give me a hysterectomy. I can't live like this anymore. I can't function. So she did. She went in to try to do it laparoscopically to just see what we were dealing with and almost ruptured my bowel. And then from there, she closed me up and said, this is above my pay grade. I've never seen anything this bad. So she sent me to U of M, to the top endometriosis specialist at U of M, where everybody is sent, right? For the worst of the worst.
About that, yeah.
I am not, no offense to U of M, I'm sure they do amazing healthcare, and I'm not going to deem the entire healthcare system crap because of one doctor. But the sad part was this was a woman. This was a female doctor, head of the department, looked me in my face after looking at all of those, the images and everything that was sent over, and basically dismissed me as if I was crazy. There wasn't something wrong with me. I didn't need something. And so anyway, fast forward a year. It took me over a year to find, not only one, to figure out what was wrong with me, because I basically self-diagnosed myself and then found doctors to back up my suspicions. No doctor told me I had this. I had to figure out what was wrong with me. Yeah. And I had never heard of adhesion-related disorder. I also found out that I had my endometriosis was so severe and had been spreading for 5 years. And for those that don't, for anyone male particularly that is listening that doesn't know what endometriosis is, it's basically when the tissue of that grows inside your uterus starts growing outside your uterus, and then it spreads, and it's painful and whatever. So it had spread so far, it was up over my omentum, like over my intestines. It was everywhere, and the adhesions were everywhere. So everything was glued together. And so finally I found these great doctors at Beaumont who are still my team today, and who were able to go in, and they had to do a full open laparotomy on me and separate all my organs. And at one point I thought I was going to have a colostomy bag. I mean, things were rupturing. I mean, it was awful. And when you talk about doctors wanting to make decisions or not let women have choices over this type of thing, even my OB at the time, who was amazing, he knew what adhesion disorder was, he understood why I had it, and he understood how to fix it. He still was hesitant to take both of my ovaries. And ultimately, I told him, take them now, because they said, don't have any more surgeries because it's going to create more scar tissue.
Yeah.
And I begged him to take them both. And when I woke up from that surgery, he did not take my ovaries. And because of that decision, because of the decision he made while I was unconscious, they missed a speck of endometriosis. And that 12 weeks later, I was in an emergency room back having a second open laparotomy because everything re-glued. And then it was worse. They ended up having to remove half my omentum. And that was really the time where we thought, oh my God, I might have to have a colostomy bag. So then there's been the whole aftermath of that too, and nerve damage and stuff. So this is what I've been through, and I still have the disorder. But thankfully now that I had to go through menopause to get to this level of survival suffering, at least the adhesions are not growing anymore. You know what I mean? So I still have difficulties and pain and problems, but
that, like, just like menopause, the unfortunate thing is that they don't know shit about adhesion-related disorder. You literally can't see it on any imaging. They have no idea when it starts. It can trigger back up at any time.
And there's no
at best, do you know what the cutting edge thing is for dealing with it? They're trying to figure out when they cut you open what stuff they can pour inside you. Something they can pour inside on everything that will like knock down the desire for everything to want to like scar up. That's where we're at. That's our understanding of it.
Well, and for many women who I have found out since I got that diagnosis and been through all this over the last 5 years, there's actually a lot of women who have this issue, but as you mentioned, you cannot see it on X-ray, CAT scan, MRI. Only way people find this is accidentally through a surgery. And what a lot of previously, when they first discovered this was something where a lot of people were putting in mesh to keep the organs from sticking together. And then there's women who've had that where the mesh gets stuck. I mean, there's just so much stuff, that was complications. So anyway, it's been an ordeal, but I have found out more and more women I know have this or have had this, and they're starting to learn more and do more, but there's no cure for it. So on top of the menopause symptoms and not being able to take hormone replacement therapy, because that could potentially mimic estrogen reproduction, which could then reignite my adhesions growing. So I have an OB oncologist now that was like, under no circumstances can you take hormone replacement therapy. So it's a rough gig we got here as women, but you know what? We're tough and we freaking deal with it because that's what we do. What else can you do? So I think I will tell you this, though. I don't know where you're going further. I know we're kind of roughing up here at around an hour and a half, but I always like to I just pour so much information on Jason every time this poor man has to sit through all of our rhetoric on my show. Well, I feel like I said, hopefully he learns something new every time, and I always love to get his feedback.
I honestly have to apologize because in prep for this, I had like all the tabs for some lists of a lot of information on the my iPad. And then I realized the last minute I was putting that, up on a tripod to look at it, and I was like, I don't have more information. So I do feel bad that I wasn't able to be more, chart specific, give, other than holding up the book. But my ultimate desire is that, one, we all need to understand that menopause is a thing that affects a lot of people. It affects people over a long period of time, and they suffer from it. So we need to give them more grace and understanding. Two,
and don't bless Karen.
Yeah, and two, that there are many, 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 many issues within the reproductive health system that it makes it complicated. That's why they need control over their own bodies. It's not just about babies. Most of it's about all the other stuff. And if we remove that idea of taking away healthcare or not talking about it for people with reproductive health systems, then they will be able to get all of the care and choices that they can get. And it's a complex, like, my system's simple. Like, if I want to get a physical for sports, a doctor, cups my nuts and makes me cough. When I'm 40, someone's supposed to stick their finger in my butt. That's it. Like, that's it. I'm not supposed to there's nothing else to monitor other than that. And that's not the other side of the equation. Their system from 12, 13, 14 is painful and complex and monthly and fraught with many, many, many things that can happen. So, and like I said, untreated healthcare issues leads to suffering, and I'm against suffering. And none of these are issues I can suffer from. Even I could make all the jokes in the world. My wife's going through menopause. My wife's like, she's the sweetest. You guys on this podcast, she's awesome. She's awesome at home too. Even when we argue, she's awesome. Like, that arguing is just, a relationship thing.
Can you make that a soundbite, Jason?
She's
absolutely.
She suffers in her own way, and she doesn't put it on me. So I'm lucky, but I can see how that's suffering for her. And I know many people dealing with, like I said, not just menopause, from endometriosis and polycystic ovaries and all of the things, preeclampsia and gestational diabetes and postpartum depression and broken spines, and just men, look up what an episiotomy is. And figure out a way you would be willing to perform that on yourself. And once you realize you wouldn't do that, understand there needs to be a lot more care, compassion, and understanding for the other side of the reproductive system. So at the end, that's my point for doing this. That's my desire. I just want more people to understand menopause. I want more people to understand reproductive health in general needs more understanding, and people that have reproductive health systems need more control over their own lives so they can suffer less.
Thank you for tackling this very important subject, my love. Jason, want to talk about hoo-haws and ding-a-lings? Let's go. We're going to keep it real scientific here today.
Right. Well, first of all, let me say, Charles, absolute pleasure to have you in the driver's seat this week. You nailed it. Knocked it right out of the park. Very informative, yet very personal. And that was what makes very compelling audio and video. So, very well done, my friend. Damn, a lot to unpack here. And I think the biggest takeaway here is you put the spotlight on so many things that a lot of people are dealing with, but like you said, nobody is talking about for one reason or the other. How many men are experiencing the same kind of scenarios, and not only that, but the feelings and their internal struggle as they're watching their wives, their significant others go through this. You know, there needs to be more avenues for communication for this, because I feel like any man that is dealing with this, that is listening to your particular story, like yes, I went through that. Yes, I can relate to this. Yes, I get what he's saying. And it opens up that conversation. Not only that, it makes them feel like that they're not alone, because us as men and our egos are as such that sometimes it is hard for us to look for some sort of support, even though that's exactly what we need. And I feel like in this day and age, we're kind of getting away from the whole macho man gimmick and actually starting to tap into our inner workings, our feelings, our fears and things of this nature. Yes, men get scared. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. We're human beings. The other side of that, Kristin, Jesus Christ, I mean, you sat here and laid out your side of this whole thing, and like as I'm hearing you,
bullet points. There's so much in between. I feel like you've gotten to know me so bad, more in 6 weeks than most people do.
Right.
100%. 100%. And I realized that listening to this, I'm like, how many other people know this part of her? Probably not a whole lot. 13 or 14, miscarriages, and your husband don't come out of his goddamn seat. So it's like, look, I already had a great deal of respect for you, but knowing what you've been going through, and Charles, you and I don't know each other as well as I know Kristin, but like I'm sitting here and I'm getting a better understanding of what makes you tick too. And the cool thing about this is, man, you are dialed into your wife. And I absolutely love that. As a newlywed myself, and having the feelings that I have for my wife, I take great appreciation in that, because I feel like men really need to dial in more to what is happening with their wives. They're your one. You know what I mean? We are expected to be taken care of. Why are we not doing that?
Guys our age are kind of at the cusp where we kind of came up when you're not supposed to care about your wife, but also right around our edge, like guys started to care about, so it is, and if you do, it makes for a better relationship and like a better experience, so her and I have been together 16 years. If I didn't give a shit about her, she would have bounced.
Right.
Well, and I will say this. I think I've lost count, because, I mean, we could do a whole other episode on what's happened since then. But, since Charles and I have been married, I have had at least 1, 2, 3, 4. I've had 5 major operations. And I have also had, then, because of the nerve damage that came from it, 16 procedures. Just as recently, you and I were talking, Jason, last week, I just had a procedure with my new bladder implant my second upgrade of that, which was a 2-part surgery. But that was as a result of the nerve damage that happened from the previous surgeries I just mentioned. And there was a whole gamut of things that happened in between. So
that's what I refer to, like every time. This is the thing, man. Like it's a domino effect. Like if you deny a woman or person, who can get pregnant, you deny them the ability to not be pregnant or take care of pregnancy. Once you lead to a pregnancy, there's all these complications. Once you lead to a pregnancy, there's possible cesarean. Once you're cutting into bodies. There's things that happen. You trigger things on and on. There's a domino effect. A pregnancy is not just its own thing. It is a domino effect through the reproductive health system, through the entire life. and it leads to the things that Kristin is dealing with. And
I
that's
am not alone.
my biggest point is it's not none of these are one-shot things. It's an entire journey. The whole healthcare system for that reproductive system needs to be comprehensive from 12 to 60 and beyond, and understand the entire process. Because cutting into the body, without giving a shit about it early on, led to my wife having all her organs fused together now.
Right.
And 19 procedures total.
Yeah.
So I will end with this, because there is hope. Just so we know, you're always looking for that silver lining, Jason. So there is hope. Thank God for science, medicine, technology. Thank God for doctors who there are still in this very corporate, capitalistic, medicine used to be to heal people, and now it's to make money, right? So, and it's both, but it's there comes a point where there are still wonderful physicians out there who have not lost their humanity. In fact, most of my doctors are very wonderful men. I'm not saying there aren't great female doctors, but there are men out there who do care about women, about women's health, about their bodies, and about our future. And there are all kinds of holistic and big pharma things that can, solutions and modalities that can help. And people who do yoga, and there's now, we could do a whole story about pelvic floor physical therapy. I don't recommend it, but it works for a lot of women. There's ways to deal with this, but most of them are unpleasant. Being a woman is just typically unpleasant. It's why we eat chocolate. It's why we go on girl trips. It's why we drink wine and paint things, because as you can see, it's just a shit show from start to finish. So, but I do appreciate you giving us a platform to talk about this subject, and hopefully people learn more and know that they're, most importantly, not alone. There's no shame in talking about this. This is no different than diabetes or anything else. It's a medical thing, and I'm glad we're living in a time where we can have these conversations, and I'm on this show with two men talking about this, because you have a wife, Jason. She has daughters.
Yep.
You have a daughter.
Yep.
This could happen to your child. It will happen at some point, the menopause part, but you know what I mean? So this is just, it's a very important thing, and to kind of take that taboo and that stigma away from being able to openly, there's nothing embarrassing about this to me. It's just life, so hopefully this story did what my show is intended to do, which is inspire stories that inspire, heal, and unite. So hopefully someone listening out there feels not alone, and there is hope. And feel free to shoot us a message too on the Facebook page, or email the PFC Entertainment Network. If you're a woman out there struggling and you with one of these issues, and you need a doctor here in Southeast Michigan, you call me or message me. I'm happy to send you the tippity top, best of the best referrals to teams that tackle this. So on that note, this was an episode takeover, and I think you impressed a lot of ladies out there listening today, honey. Oh, they're going to be kicking their husband's ass in a minute, going, "Hey, you didn't give a shit about my menopause."
That'll be nothing compared to my feminism episode. So,
oh shit, he's taking another episode.
That'll be like a 3-part.
So, oh God, we might do a mini-series. So
yeah,
everyone, thanks for tuning in today. Jason, thank you as always for pushing the buttons and making the magic happen. And honey, thanks for sitting with me through 16 years of this bliss. And
I love you, and thank you for letting me vent and get this out on this. And Jason, thank you for letting us do it as well.
Absolutely.
Be blessed. We'll see you guys next week on Say What.